The English War by Dorothy L. Sayers. Praise God now for an English war. The grey tide and the sullen coast, the menace of the urgent hour, the single island like a tower ringed with an angry host. This is the war that England knows, when all the world holds but one man, King Philip of the galleons, Louis, whose light outshone the suns, the conquering Corsican. When Europe like a prison door clangs, and the swift enfranchised sea runs narrower than a village brook, and men who love us not yet look to us for liberty. When no allies are left, no help to count upon from alien hands, no waverers remain to woo, no more advice to listen to, and only England stands. This is the war we always knew, when every county keeps her own, when Kent stands sentry in the lane, and Fenland guards her dyke and drain, Cornwall her cliffs of stone. When from the Cinque Ports and the Wight, from Plymouth Sound and Bristol town, there comes a noise that breaks our sleep of the deep calling to the deep, where the ships go up and down. And near and far across the world hold open wide the water gates, and all the tall adventurers come homeward to England, and Drake's drum is beaten through the straits. This is the war that we have known and fought in every 100 years. Our sword upon the last steep path, forged by the hammer of our wrath on the anvil of our fears. Send us, O God, the will and power to do as we have done before. The men that ride the sea and air are the same men their fathers were to fight the English war. And send, O God, an English peace, some sense, some decency perhaps, some justice too if we are able, with no sly jackals around our table cringing for blood-stained scraps. No dangerous dreams of wishful men whose homes are safe, who never feel the flying death that swoops and stuns, the kisses of the curtsying guns slavering their street with steel. No dream, Lord God, but vigilance, that we may keep by might and main in violet seas and violet skies. But if another tyrant rise, then we shall fight again. Defence of the Islands. Let these memorials of built stone, music's enduring instrument of many centuries of patient cultivation of the earth, of English verse, be joined with the memory of this defence of the islands, and the memory of those appointed to the grey ships, battleship, merchantman, trawler, contributing their share to the age's pavement of British bone on the sea floor, and of those who in man's newest form of gamble with death fight the power of darkness in air and fire, and of those who followed their forebears to Flanders and France, those undefeated in defeat, unalterable in triumph, changing nothing of their ancestors' ways but the weapons, and those again for whom the paths of glory are the lanes and streets of Britain, to say, to the past and the future generations of our kin and of our speech, that we took up our positions in obedience to instructions. The two poems I've read are close companions. Their authors were of a similar age. T.S. Eliot was born 5 years before and died 9 years after Dorothy Sayers. Both ended up as serious Orthodox Anglican Christians, and both poems cover the same general event and were written about the same time. And what I'll do is try to make a few general observations about the poems, and then draw out similarities and some differences. Let's consider Sayers' poem first. It's not quite a perfect poem. Its last 2 verses slide into old tropes without the resonance and power needed to prevent those tropes from becoming cliché, but it is, on the whole, a very fine poem. It's complex in form. It's easy to stumble over reading it, certainly, as indeed I did. It has surprising internal rhymes. It has hard phrases that are difficult to read quickly, that sort of thing. But it works. It intentionally rests largely on old images, and until the end, as I say, it manages, I think, to imbue them with real force. The poem was published in the Times Literary Supplement in September 1940. England and her daughters overseas were now alone in their war against Germany, who had either conquered or made alliances with nearly every European nation from the Atlantic to the Soviet Union. Only neutral Switzerland and Sweden stood apart. England for Sayers means the place of the English-speaking peoples, that is Britain. England then, though supported loyally by her dominions, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and a little more reluctantly by South Africa, able to draw nonetheless on the vast resources of her Indian and African empire, it was in a grave situation. September 1940 was the height of the Battle of Britain. A Luftwaffe victory would have opened up the very real possibility of a German invasion of the British Isles. Panzers might have rolled down Whitehall and the populace of the East End sent to liquidation camps. We may think Sayers is simply trying to be encouraging, but I suspect the surprising conclusion she comes to here was sincere and widely held. This is the war that England knows when all the world holds but one man. Sayers mentions Philip II of Spain, Louis XIV of France, the Emperor Napoleon, all people she quite understandably understands to be representative of tyranny and conquest on the continent. And a new tyrant on the continent had arisen in Hitler, and Sayers would likely have seen Stalin in the same light. Now England was Europe's only hope. We see the same sense of urgency and destiny in Churchill's finest hour speech from June of 1940, where the Prime Minister said of the approaching ordeal, "What General Weygand called the Battle of France is over. I expect that the Battle of Britain is about to begin. Upon this battle depends the survival of Christian civilization. Upon it depends our own British life and the long continuity of our institutions and of our empire. The whole fury and might of the enemy must very soon be turned on us. Hitler knows they will have to break us in this island or lose the war. If we can stand up to him, all Europe may be free and the life of the world may move forward into broad sunlit uplands. But if we fail, then the whole world, including the United States, including all that we have known and cared for, will sink into the abyss of a new dark age made more sinister and perhaps more protracted by the lights of perverted science." So this solitary stand that the British Empire was making was an encouragement to Sayers, and a sincere one, because it reminds her of those previous defiances of continental conquerors. Certainly versus Philip II and Napoleon, England often stood alone and faced invasion threats from both, famously with the Armada. And it also comforts her, this standing alone, because Sayers is, in her own mind, as for virtually any British person then alive, English, not European. You see the same fact reflected upon by Orwell and by Lewis at the same time. Sayers talks of the European nations as men who love us not, for all the noble common suffering of the British and French armies in the First War and the opening months of the Second. No Englishman or Frenchman of the time would have been ignorant of the 125 years between 1688 and 1815 of nearly constant warfare between England and France, and indeed the 100 Years' War several centuries prior to that. England was France's closest neighbour and longest standing enemy. It's in that vein that Sayers is relieved that there is now no help to count upon from alien hands and no more advice to listen to. Only England stands. Now, one of the rhetorical high points for me of this poem is where Sayers conjures up the image of England's coastal counties standing to their post and the Royal Navy preparing for battle. She appeals to the landscape of those counties. When Kent stands sentry in the lane and Fenland guards her dyke and drain, Cornwall her cliffs of stone, and she speaks of how all the tall adventurers come homeward to England and Drake's drum is beaten through the straits. England in 1940 to Sayers is England in 1588 or 1759, the glorious 1st of June, and 1803. Those great naval victories will come again, she thinks, joined now by victories in the air, because the men that ride the sea and air are the same men their fathers were, to fight the English war. Meanwhile, Eliot's poem was written in the second half of 1940. He dates it to just after the Dunkirk evacuation, and it accompanied an exhibition of photos in New York in 1941 depicting the British war effort, which was shown prior to the US joining the war. And it's by no means Eliot's best poem, even his best war poem. Indeed, he denounced the idea that it was even verse, because each verse in this poem had been intended as a sort of poetic prose commentary on accompanying photos. He thought that on its own it wasn't very good. But it is moving, and it does echo Sayers in many ways. And it's telling that 5 of the 7 verses in some way hint at a connection with the past, with the continuity with the England of old. Eliot speaks of many centuries of patient cultivation of the earth and of this defence of the island as if there were others. Eliot commemorates the efforts of the Royal Navy by telling of their contributing their share, not just the Royal Navy indeed, but also the Merchant Navy and fishermen, contributing their share to the age's pavement of British bone on the sea floor. And he connects the soldiers of the British Army going over to France not only with those of the First World War, but also, by implication, prior generations who had fought in France and Belgium, the ancestors, from Wellington and Marlborough, all the way back to the 100 Years' War. Where Sayers tells us the men that ride the sea and air are the same men their fathers were, Eliot says they are changing nothing of their ancestors' ways, but the weapons. The sentiment is the same. And the final time he references the connection of the British defenders with their own past is the final verse. That all this is to say, or the monuments are to say, to the past and the future generations of our kin and of our speech, that we took up our positions in obedience to instructions. So there are many similarities between Sayers and Eliot, certainly. Both rely on similar themes and even similar images. Both eschew traditional verse form in favour of what we've talked about a little bit in talking about Yeats, about modernism. They do it in different ways, though. They have a similar sensibility, they have a similar view on events, but the last verse in Eliot shows a big difference, to me at least, other than that the Sayers poem is probably better anyway. Sayers is much more positive about the role that England plays. It fights tyrants, it even defends those who don't love it. And her closing thought is that it'd be great to have an English peace, justice, peace and quiet, no bragging, just decency. But Eliot never mentions the moral weight of the British cause, and he does not really mention it in the other two war poems he puts in his collected poems. And his closing thought is a more sober and severe one, about duty. He wants the war memorials to say to the past and the future generations of our kin and of our speech that we took up our position in obedience to instructions. Sayers writes to strengthen the will of her British audience and to look forward to peace. Eliot writes to honour the work ongoing, the obedience ongoing, and significantly to call those of our kin and of our speech, that is Americans really, to the aid of Britain. Partly the difference in tone is to do with the purpose of the poems then, but partly I think it tells us about the characters of the respective authors. Sayers, a rather more sanguine, cheerful figure, looks forward to peace and quiet after the war. Eliot is soberly focused on the continuity of an English sense of duty. They share in England, but what they love about it is subtly different, and these poems give us a hint about that. Well, that's it from me. Do tell me what you thought of the poems.